The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TechGig webinar series, our endeavor to empower techies. We believe that sharing of knowledge is the key to enhance our skills and grow us as professionals. With this principle in mind, we have initiated a series of webinars conducted by industry experts to give you all a crisp insight of various domains. The topic of today's session is Developing ASP .NET MVC applications, and this is the part 1 of the series. And our guest speaker today is Hina Mehta. She is the Principal, Education Training and Assessment at Infosys in Technologies. Hina is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Developer, Web Applications and Microsoft Certified Trainer. She is also IBM Certified Solution Advisor for Cloud Computing Architecture. She has an overall experience of more than 18 years in the areas of information technology and engineering. Databases, application lifecycle management, and Windows Azure are key areas of work along with management-related responsibilities. Currently, she is working on SQL Server 2012, SQL Server 2014, and VS 2013 products. So, without further delay, I introduce you all to our guest speaker. Over to you, Hina.
Yeah, thank you, Aradhana, and good evening, all of you. The topic that we would talk about today would be developing of ASP.NET MVC application. This particular seminar would be the first in the series where, as part of the complete series, we will talk about different aspects that are related to ASP.NET MVC development. There was a startup session on this when we had introduced ourselves to the ASP.NET MVC project creation and the MVC pattern itself. So today's session we would be covering certain things related to ASP.NET MVC application development, where we will start by understanding how can I create ASP.NET MVC projects, and once ASP.NET MVC projects are created, how will I go ahead and add my controller components, the view components, and the model components. Also look at how will you register appropriate routing mechanism that would make sure the corresponding controllers are getting executed when you browse your required website. So if you look at the features of ASP.NET MVC, we have been talking about the MVC pattern and its implementation with ASP.NET web application scenarios starting from 2007, where we had the first version of MVC released as MVC version 1. With coming years, there have been multiple advancements and multiple enhancements that have gone behind MVC framework, and we have multiple versions of ASP.NET MVC framework that were released. We had MVC 1, we had 2, we had 3, we had MVC 4, we have MVC 5, and with MVC 5, now we have a 5.2, which happens to be the latest release. With each of the versions that have been released with MVC, there have been a couple of enhancements and extra features that have got introduced within your MVC applications. With MVC 3 framework version, we had a new view engine that was introduced, which is called the new Razor View engine. Prior to this, when we did MVC 2 development or MVC 1 development, the view engine that was used for display purposes was primarily the ASPX view engine. With MVC4, which has been a very recent release and is still getting adopted extensively, there have been features that have got added to MVC4, and these features include features like adaptive rendering. With MVC4, it targeted more of mobile devices and it supported adaptive rendering of your views depending on which device I am using to view my MVC applications. Also, support for open authentication was introduced with MVC4. Mobile templates were added with the MVC4 version of the framework. And in MVC5, we have a complete new template that has replaced the default MVC template, and this is based on the Bootstrap engine which has got introduced with MVC5. MVC5 also adds support for attribute routing that has got introduced. So when we actually look at routing, we would be able to understand what attribute routing is all about and understand it in a much better fashion. So with not much of delay, I would actually move on to the demos of how do you get started on creating a MVC application and start building your controllers, the view components and the model components. So let me switch to Visual Studio environment. And now we will start looking at our first MVC application. Within a Visual Studio environment, when I want to create a MVC project, I start by saying File, New Project, go to the Web option under Visual C# or Visual Basic, and within that particular web option, I would see templates available for me to create MVC applications which are MVC3 framework targeting applications and MVC4 applications. So depending on what category of MVC framework I want to build my applications for, we would start with creating our MVC application. And once we have selected a specific template to build our MVC application, it would ask you to select a specific template on which you want to build your project. With MVC3, I have 3 templates that are available, which would be a empty MVC project template, a internet-facing application template, wherein you want to build your MVC application for internet-based users, or a intranet application template. So these are the 3 templates that are available with MVC3, and based on my requirement, I can start with either an intranet application or an internet application. If you select an empty template for your MVC3 application development, then you will have to manually add the different components that you want to include within your MVC application. You will have to decide what would be your controller components, what will be your view components, and what will be your model components. And then build your entire application by explicitly defining the model, the view, and the controller components. So whenever you feel the need of starting with an MVC application from scratch, Then you can start with the empty template or the empty project template. But if you want to have a base structure and a framework available, you may want to choose the internet template or the intranet application template. In addition to making a choice about the project template that you would want to use, the other thing that you will be allowed to choose is the view engine. Do you want to build up your view definitions for ASPX view engine, or do you want your view definitions to be executed through a Razor view engine? These are two view engines that are available, and as I had mentioned, Razor view engine is introduced only from MVC 3. Prior to that, we had only the ASPX view engine. So I would be allowed to choose a specific view engine based on which I would have to build my view definitions. If I would have not selected an MVC3 application, instead I go for a MVC4 implementation, in which case, if you notice, when I say I want to build up MVC4 web application, the number of templates that have got added with MVC4 are clearly more than what was available with an MVC3 application. With MVC4, in addition to having the empty template, the internet template, the intranet template, you also have other terms that have got added. You will see a template for creating applications that can be targeted for mobile devices, applications that use a web API approach to access your data as well as your functionalities, applications which use a basic or a single page authentication with MVC implementation, applications which basically allow users to be authenticated using third-party credential owners. So while a user is developing a MVC application, instead of users giving a separate form where the user is asked to enter user ID and password, I can delegate that responsibility to a third party like Facebook. I can allow the user to authenticate themselves using either Facebook credentials or using Google credentials. So clearly, if you notice, between MVC3 and MVC4, you have mobile templates getting introduced, you have Facebook authentication getting introduced, and that is what is referred to as open authentication or the OAuth model for authenticating your users, plus our basic set of templates that are anyways always available. So depending on what category of application I would want to work with, I will either choose a MVC3 or an MVC4 application. These templates you will find if you are working with Visual Studio 2012 environment. If you probably pick up a Visual Studio 2013 environment, you will find a new template that has got introduced, which is based on MVC5 framework. So you need to work with the appropriate framework based on what features you would want to leverage for your MVC application. Now, if you see here, this was my application. I will try to open my existing application. Okay, Let's see our basic application, which is a sample MVC application. If you look at the sample MVC application and try to understand the project structure, in your sample MVC application, you will notice that there are folders available called the controller folder, the models folder, and the views folder. What would the controllers folder contain? The controller folder would contain definition for your controller components. Every controller that you would want to add within your MVC application will be added as a controller class, and this particular controller class needs to be prefixed, or rather suffixed, should have a controller keyword attached. So in my sample application, I have two controller classes that I have defined. The first controller class that I have is a sample controller. So if you see the name of the controller class, it would be sample followed by controller keyword .cs. At any point of time, if I want to add new controllers to my application, I can just right click the controller folder and say add a new controller. And when I choose add a new controller, it would open up a box, and over here when I am asked to enter the controller name, if you see, it is only allowing me to edit the first part of the controller name. The next part, which is the controller keyword, is predefined. You are not allowed to change it. So you can give any particular controller name, which is, let's say, the test controller. Okay. And currently I do not want any auto-generated code. Scaffolding is basically for me to supply, do I want any auto-generated code as part of my controller class. So for now, I do not want any auto-generated code as part of my controller class. So I would go ahead and just say it is an empty controller and say add. The moment I add a test controller, you will see that in your controller folder, there would be a .cs file, a class library that would have got added, and the name of that class library would be testcontroller.cs. This particular class library would be having a definition of the class called test controller, which is inheriting its properties from the controller as your base class. And in your controller class, you are expected to define a set of action methods. You should notice that there is a test controller class which has been created. You just entered the keyword test. The controller keyword was auto appended to your controller class. So you create a test controller class, and by default, all controller classes that you add within an MVC application would have one default action, and that default action is called the index action. Right? So we have one default action method that is automatically added as part of your controller class, and that default action method is called the index action method. Now that I know that yes, I have an index action method, as part of this index action method, what is it that I am supposed to do? Over here, I am just trying to say, as part of the index action method, return a view. Now, where is the view? which is the file that needs to be rendered. If the user says, I want to display a particular page, what would be the execution path which needs to be followed? In your browser, whenever the user gives a request, earlier when we had developed ASP.NET web application using the web form implementation, we used to give our URLs where the URL used to contain the name of the ASP page that I want to be displayed. So what was the format in which I was giving my URL? It was typically an HTTP URL which was ending with the ASPX file name. And that particular file name is what was rendered to me. But with MVC implementation, when I am working on MVC applications, my URL itself will be a different mechanism that I will follow. All my URLs would follow a mechanism wherein it would have the HTTP localhost followed by the controller class, and within the controller class name, what is the action that I would want to execute. So if I want this particular method to be executed, right, this is my method that I wanted to execute, my URL would probably say HTTP test controller / index action. Controller name / the index action. Now, let's see if I try to request for this particular index action to be executed, what would be your execution pattern? So I will go ahead, right click my project and say debug to start new instance. Now when I say I want to start a new instance, it's clearly giving me an error. My URL is not following the required format which I have just now told you. What is the format which my URLs have to follow? The URLs have to follow the controller name / the action name. So what was my controller name? It was test. So I try to modify the URL by saying test, and the test controller in turn has got which method? It has got an index method. So that is what I will try and execute. And now I press a return. Look at it. The moment I say I want to execute the index method, index action of the test controller class, that index action is getting executed, but what is it that the index action is doing? It is trying to return a view, and your framework is trying to search for that view definition. Currently, you do not have that particular view definition, right? You do not have that view definition. So what do? Let's go back to our Visual Studio environment, and instead of saying return view, let me comment out this particular line. Let me try and just return a simple string which says hello world. Now because I am returning a string, I want to change the return type also to string. Fair enough? Now come back and build your project again. You have completely built your project. Let us now go back to our browser window. We'll have to execute it again. So let me go to debug, start new instance. Once again, I will have to modify the URL to ensure that I am executing the test controller, And within the test controller, I'm executing the index action and press a return, and you will see automatically the return value. What is that return value? It is hello world, which is what I was doing as part of my controller class, right? Now I don't want to return just a simple string. I want to actually display a page, right? Which is my view definition. So I have to create a view definition and return that view definition as part of my action method. To be able to do that, what can we do? We'll again come back to our solution. Once again, put our string in comment, modify the index action to return an action result, and uncomment this part, which is the return view definition. Now that I know, yes, it has to return a view definition, I have to create that view definition. How can I create a view definition? I will come to the action method, right click the action method and say add view. Do you see that option coming up? So you will now need to add a view. When you say you want to add a view, it will give me the name. And if you notice, the name of your view is same as the name of your action method. What is the name of your action method? It is nothing but index, and the name of your view is index. What is the view engine that you would want? Either a Razor or a ASP view engine. You may want to go ahead and select that. Do you want to have a layout or a master page for your view definition? I may just probably want to leave it as blank, and then I say add. The moment I say add a view, you will notice that it has gone ahead and added a view like this. That's the definition. And over here, let me type, this is my index page. I go ahead and type this particular text which says this is my index page. Once I have defined my index, now let me go ahead and browse through the same URL again. This time when I modify the URL to say it has to execute the index method of your test controller class, what would it execute? It will execute the index action. And what is your index action doing? It is in turn returning a view definition. Which view definition should it return? It should return index.cshtml. So let me press a return, and you see this is my index page. That is the view that it has gone ahead and displayed. So you have created a view definition for your controller action method, which is what is being displayed as part of the URL request. Now, where is this particular index.cshtml file getting created? Let me stop the execution of the application. Then go back to my Solution Explorer and observe our Views folder. Under our Views folder, you will notice that there is a new folder that has been added called the Test folder, corresponding to my test controller. And in this particular folder, there is a file that has got added called the index.cshtml, right? So precisely how do you think the entire execution is happening? In an MVC implementation, the user specifies as part of the URL the action that the user has to execute, and in response to your controller action method, your view pages are being displayed to the end user. And this particular routing that we are talking about, where you're saying there has to be a format for your URL, wherein the URL says HTTP localhost controller name / action name. This entire information is defined in your file, which is called the global.asxa file. And if you see, I'm opening up the global.asxa file for you, and let's have a look at this particular file. The global.asxa file has got one method which is called the registered routes method. And your registered routes method has a particular function which registers your routing format. How do you want the action methods of your controller class to be executed is what I am specifying using the map route method using the routes variable, which is of type route selection. So I am saying route dot map route, and what is it mapping to? It is mapping, this is a default routing mechanism that I have created. So I am trying to say the route name is default. What is the format of my URL? My format has to be controller / action / any parameter values. And what are the default values for controller action and ID? The default values for controller action and ID are home controller, index action, and optional parameter. That is why when I executed the application, it tried to search for a home controller, under which it tried to search for an index action. Do you have that? You do not have in your application any home controller or any index method. Therefore, it gave you an error, and that is when you modified the URL. Now what I do is I change the default controller name to test. I change my action method, let it be retained as index. Let me save this project and let's now try to re-execute. Now what is your default route? It is test controller. Within the test controller, it is executing your index action, and the index action in turn is displaying your index.cs HTML page. Right? So this is how you go ahead and work with a basic MVC application. Whether it is version 3 or version 4, this basic structure is not going to change. Just like I have my test controller, I also have another controller class called a sample controller class. And what are the things that I have as part of my sample controller? I have an index method. Now, in my previous sample, what did I show you? I had an index method that was being executed, and the controller action method was getting executed to display your index page. If you want your action method to send some data that needs to be displayed in your view pages, that entire data interchange happens using two objects. The first object is a view bag object, and the second object is your view data object. The view data object is a static dictionary object. So when I look at the view data object which is there in your display action, the view data object is a static dictionary object which was available with MVC 1 and 2. But with MVC 3, a new object has been introduced called the view bag object, and the view bag object clearly is a dynamic selection property, right? So if you actually hover on to the view bag, you will notice that it shows you that it's a dynamic dictionary object, whereas your view data was more of a static dictionary object. Both these objects allow you to return data to the view before it can be displayed. So over here, what am I trying to do? I'm saying I have an index action, and as part of the index action, I'm saying I want to add a message, which is viewBag.message, and this is the static message that I want, and then I say return view. Now which view will it return? There should be a view definition called index.something, whether it is based on view engine, either it will be index.asps or index.cshtml. If you try to search for these files in your sample folder under the views folder and try to display that view, and this view that it displays will display your message also. So let's see the index. Where is the index? We said in the sample controller there are two files. If you can see within your sample folder under the views, you will notice there are two files that are available called the display.asps. This file corresponds to the display action of your sample controller class. You also have index.asps, which corresponds to the index action of your sample controller class. So let's open the index page first. And when you open up the index page, you will notice that it is displaying your view bag information by using a ASPX view engine syntax. Wherever you see a percentage, it is ASPX view engine syntax. Wherever you see a @, it is Razor view engine syntax. So now I know that yes, I have a test controller, and that is what will have a index method. So let me again execute the application and now modify the URL to say execute the index method of your sample controller. And when I say this, what do I get? I get this is index action execution and a test message. Where have I got the test message data from? I have got it from the controller. Controller has sent that data for display using the view definition, which is the index view definition. Just like I had an index view, I also had a display view. So let me check if I can go ahead and modify this URL to do the display part. So how do I do it? I say display. And you will see here, you will have your output which is part of your display.aspx page, which says this is the first page in MVC and welcome. Where is your welcome coming from? If you remember, this is your view data. And that is what is sent by your display action to your display view. So let's see the display view now. And you will find that in your display view, you are trying to access the view data. Right? So whenever I'm having controllers and view definitions, controllers are sending data to the view definitions using view bag and view data. But when I use view bag or view data, it is basically my own custom information. Supposing I have a business entity created and I want to transfer data based on the business entity. This particular business entity is basically a mechanism wherein I will define my model component. So let's see a sample model definition before we proceed further. So we have looked at a test controller. We have understood how to write basic controllers. We've also understood how to write a controller which is having an associated created view definition and how can I transfer data from the controller to the view definition class. Now we will try and build a controller which is displaying a specific business entity information in the form of an employee controller class. So let's look at this particular controller, and if you see in this controller, it is using a employee class. And what is your employee class? Your employee class is nothing but defined under the models folder of your application, which is nothing but your employee class library. Your employee class library has got 3 attributes: employee code, employee name, and salary, and it is trying to just initialize these values. This is your business class definition, which acts like your model, and your controller class, which is the employee controller class, is making use of this particular model to pass data to the view. So now if I open up the employee controller class, you will notice that whenever I am returning a view, I am passing the object. What is the data I have to send to the view? I have to send an employee object to the view. So I have created an employee object, I have initialized the employee object, and I am now sending the employee object to be displayed using this particular view definition. Which view definition will it search for? Employee details dot the extension, depending on whether I am using view engine, ASP view engine, or Razor view engine. So I have one particular view definition which is based on Razor view. I have another view definition which is based on ASPX view. We will try and see both the view definitions now. So over here I am just having view data and returns the view. This is not using an employee object completely. Right, so now let's look at both these view definitions, which is employee details and EMP details. Where would the view definitions for both these actions be available? They will be available under the employee folder of your views folder. So in your views folder, you will have an employee subfolder which will have 2 files now. One which corresponds to the mDetails action method, another one which corresponds to the employee details action method. If I open the mDetails action method, I will notice that there are certain details which have been returned by your action method which you are trying to display over here, right, which is using the view data. And therefore your view page is dynamic view. You see the first line, you say inherit view page dynamic. And what am I displaying? Code, name, and salary. Same way, if I try to see the employee details.cs HTML page, which is the other view corresponding to another action, this is a strongly typed view. It's not a plain dynamic view which is picking data from the controller on the fly. It is tightly binded to your model definition, which is the employee definition, and therefore it is displaying your details explicitly using the model.code, name, and salary. And this is Razor view syntax. Like I had told you, wherever we see an @ it's a Razor view. Wherever we see the percentile symbol, it is nothing but the ASPX view syntax. So now let me view both these pages one by one. Let's go back to our application. And what we will now do is, the controller that we have to use is the employee controller. And within the employee controller, we want to go ahead and use the employee details action, right? Employee controller having employee details action, and I press a return, I get my employee information. Alternatively, I can do the same thing by saying I want to view the EMP details view, and I press a return, I'll get back the same information. Similar kind of view. There is not too much of a change in the view definition. It's just the mechanism I have used. One of them is a strongly typed view, which is binded to your model definition, and the other one is a dynamic view, which is picking up data from your view data collection object. Right? So that's the different category of views that you can build up using your view definition. So you have model classes you need to create if you want to create a strongly typed view definition. Okay? Fine. So I think we will go ahead and close for now. I would want to take in more questions from you, and we will continue this particular series shortly. So the next session that we would plan is to understand the different return types that I can have as part of my action method, and how can I use these different return types to return different category of information. So what we had discussed today is, just to summarize on what we have covered today, we have understood all these things today. Creating a basic MVC project, adding controllers to a MVC project, adding view definitions to an MVC project. We also looked at our register routes method, and then also looked at the map route method, which actually registers our URL format that we should be using to call our action method. And then how do you add model data from a controller to a view definition. Okay, so with this I would want to go ahead and close the session, and we can take in questions now.
Thanks for the insightful presentation, Hina. Let's quickly take up the questions now, as you have just mentioned. I request you to read out the questions and their answers so that all our users may listen to your insights. Are you able to see the questions coming into you?
Yeah, I have opened the questions window. I'm waiting for questions to come. Yeah, I can see the questions now. I can go ahead and start answering these questions. Okay. Now the first question comes from Gauri Malani, and her question is, what is the difference between the Razor View and the ASP View engine? In terms of performance, Razor View engines are supposed to be much better and faster implementation, but there is very, very thin line of difference in terms of implementation. So both of them are used to create and develop your view definition files. ASPX is for older versions of MVC. Razor View engine is what is introduced for the newer versions of MVC framework. Right? And it is, if you see the Razor View engine, compare it with an ASPX View engine, your ASPX View engine is primarily used to do data display, whereas in a Razor View engine, the file name itself says CS-HTML, which means this particular HTML page can also have some amount of C# coding or some amount of VB coding. It could be VB HTML or CS-HTML. So you could actually do little bit of programming or control like you've been doing with JavaScripting. That level of programming control is what is possible with your Razor View engines. In terms of differences, syntax is what is different. What I can do with Razor View engine is much more specialized in terms of implementing programming logic, and it executes in a much faster fashion. Okay, the next question is come from Nivas Ramchandran, and the question says, how do you do post-back like operations in MVC? In MVC, there is nothing called post-back. If you have to do post-back, you can from one action redirect the control to another action using certain MVC methods. So while I am part of my index implementation, right, let's say the index action, and I want to redirect it to another method, I can use a redirect function call. I have a function call which says redirect to action, which will allow me to transfer control from one action method to another action method. By default, all the action methods are invoked using a get URL. So the mechanism is using a get method. You may want to go ahead and do the same thing with post implementation also. So your forms can be posted using the post keyword as well. And there you need little subtle changes in the way you are defining your action methods. Okay. Alright, so I'll read out the next question, which again is from Nivas. How static files like JavaScript are served? If you see all the static code which is there even in our project directory, the jQuery APIs, all these are used to build up your view definitions. Right, and these will be executed when your view is rendered. So when it encounters the return view instruction, what would it do? It will go and search for a view page corresponding to that action method, and whatever JavaScript is available within that view page, that particular JavaScript code will get executed by your client browser window. That is how your JavaScript codes are getting executed. Okay, now I have another question which says, which one is better between ASP.NET Web Forms based application or ASP.NET MVC based applications? Both of them are for different purposes. If I want to have an application built explicitly for web application development, I would still go ahead and have better control using a web form implementation where I can do state management extensively and very well using a web form implementation. But when I have to adopt MVC, I typically adopt MVC for two important reasons. When my applications should be clearly categorized into model, view and controller component parts, and that helps me promote reusability of my view definitions, reusability of my model definitions, or reusability of my controller components, right? So when you want to create reusable model and view components, go for MVC implementation instead of web form implementation. Another very big advantage of using MVC is it helps me to do unit testing much better. So when you have agile related projects which primarily focus on a test-driven methodology, in such situations an MVC implementation works much better compared to a web form implementation. Okay? Alright, I have a next question which is coming from Arvind, and the question is, can you please explain the special characteristics in MVC architecture compared to other architectures? If yes, in terms of what do we have? So in terms of the special characteristics of MVC architecture, I think I had just mentioned, it's an implementation of MVC pattern. MVC is one of our software design patterns that allows you to have a clear segregation of model, view and controller components as against your web form application development where you are putting everything in .aspx and .cs files here there is a very clear categorization of what has to be your model, what has to be your view, and what needs to be your controller component. Not only does it give you a clear segregation for each of these components, there will be these components which can interact with each other, and at the same time they will be very, very loosely coupled. So it helps me maintain such applications much more better way compared to a traditional web form application that we have been developing. Okay. All right. So if you see the next question, it's coming from Vijay Saradi. For the ASP view, if we use dynamic data using view data, is it still necessary to pass in the employee object to the return view object in the action method? No, it is not required. If I am using view data, then I am not leveraging strongly typed views. I am just putting all the data which my controller action has to return to the view definition using the view data dictionary and trying to retrieve back that data also using view data dictionary. I will not need to return the employee object in that scenario. Okay? Alright, so yeah, any other questions? Anything else which I have missed out answering? I think I have, whatever questions I have received, I have tried and answered all of them. Any other questions anyone has?
Hina, there are a lot of questions coming in.
Some more questions popping up.
Yes, please take them.
Okay. So let me take some more questions. Okay, Rupesh wants to know, is the location of pages strict in terms of like views of employee controller must be in employees folder? Rupesh, yes, it is fixed. You have to have a proper folder naming convention. If you do not want to follow the folder naming convention, then when you are returning your view, you have to supply the view name with the complete path. Okay, so if you want the return view instruction to automatically interpret which particular view data has to be done, then this particular information can be directly mapped on if you are following your folder structure. But if you are not following your folder structure, when you give the return view instruction, at that time, currently, if you see the way I am giving my return view method, it is just open close parenthesis. I can actually pass the name of the view that I want. And that view name should be given with the complete path. If I do that, I can skip the folder structure implementation. Okay, Nirmalya wants to know, can we send more than one model object in the view from the action method? Nirmalya, answer is yes, you can do that.
Hina, I'm really sorry to interrupt.
Yes, Aradhana.
Yes, but due to time constraint, I have to request you to take the unanswered questions offline, which I will share with you through email. So if you would like to sum up the session for today, you can do it now.
Okay, so I think I had already done the summing up. As I had mentioned, we have done the first very initial part of accessing and developing a MVC application. In the coming series of this particular presentations, I will have a lot more to discuss, wherein we will talk about concepts related to how do you modify your routes, how do you create your controller classes, how do you go ahead and create data entry screens using the view definition through the concept of HTML helper method. So with this introduction session, I would want to thank all of you who have joined for this session, and I look forward to seeing all of you in my future sessions as well. Thanks everybody.
And I'm really thankful to our guest speaker today for conducting this wonderful webinar. It was indeed a great session. I would also like to thank all our participants for their support in making this webinar a success. The recording of the webinar will be available on techgig.com by tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Hina, for taking the time out and having us. I hope you have a great evening ahead.
Thanks everybody. Good day.